who was an avid ornithologist and could recognize and reproduce birdsong. Well, today I want to tell you about an English composer by the name of Benjamin Britten. Benjamin was born in 1913 in a coastal town on the North Sea in England. His father was a dentist and very practical, but his mother was very artsy, and she was an amateur singer and really loved music. Now, she saw that her son had an amazing amount of musicality, and she was convinced that he was going to be the fourth B: Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and Britten. That didn't happen, but he did make a name for himself. When he was only 3 months old, he contracted pneumonia, and he dealt and struggled with his health for the rest of his life. Despite this, though, he started taking piano lessons from his mother, and because she was a pianist. And by the time he was only 5, he started just kind of like composing his own things, playing around, having fun. By the time he was 6, he wrote a small play, which is good because later on he's going to combine those and write operas. And then by the time he is 7, he begins formal piano lessons with somebody else. As a teenager, he started studying composition with a respected English composer by the name of Frank Bridge. And then later on, he entered into the Royal College of Music and continued his studies of composition. Britten stood out because he had this unusual productivity, but also this great imagination and curiosity for the world around him, including this ornithology. And he would study and listen to birds, like all their different ways that they would speak and sing. And he could recognize a bird by their song. He could redo it, like copy it. And he was that was just something that he was also interested in, but became very good at. By the mid-1930s, he starts composing for documentary films. And so he's really starting to hone his craft in a way that is not just composing out of like beauty and that, but that it's also telling a story in a very specific way. He's also at this time beginning to form friendships with writers and intellectuals who shaped his political and also his artistic outlook. He did make all these friends, but he was also extremely sensitive to criticism. And he could be very warm and kind and loving one day, but if you offended him, if you caught him at the wrong day, he would just cut them off. Not just in that conversation, but that friendship was over, and he would refer to that friendship as one of his corpses. And that's kind of sad. And this didn't just stop. This continued on through his life. So at the end of his life, he had quite some corpses. In the late 1930s, he makes a friend by the name of Peter Pierce. And then in 1939, they decide to sail over to America. There's a war in Europe. It's not really safe and happy. So they decide to go over as friends. Now, on this boat trip, on this trip through America, they fell in love and formed a lifelong relationship. While on this trip in America, he composes the 7 Songs of Michelangelo, which is the first of many, many pieces that he writes specifically for Peter Pierce's voice. Now, Peter Pierce is a tenor, so they work together often. They returned to Britain during the Second World War, and they both apply to be recognized as conscious objectors. Now, first, this doesn't completely go through. It's like a halfway through, and he is allowed non-combative service. He appeals that and then is granted a complete exemption from the military. He was not just trying to get out of it because he was afraid of war, which makes sense, but he really was a pacifist. And that moral stance influenced many, many of his compositions, particularly works dealing with like suffering, innocence, and definitely the tragedy of war. Britten is widely credited with reviving British opera in the 20th century. His breakthrough came with the opera Peter Grimes, which premiered in 1945 and was immediately recognized as the masterpiece that it is. This opera's dramatic psychological depth and haunting orchestration transformed British musical theater. Over his career, he wrote many important operas, including The Turn of the Screw, Billy Budd, Midsummer's Night Dream, and also Death in Venice. These operas often explore themes like innocence versus corruption, outsider in society, the moral ambiguity, themes that were important to him, of course. Life in the mid 20th century for gay men was very difficult. And during the 1950s, the Home Secretary by the name of David Fye ordered stricter enforcement for anti homosexual laws. Now, in 1953, police visited Britten at home, suspicious of his relationship with Pierce, which was, of course, a homosexual relationship. But this incident really frightened him. He didn't want to go to jail, and he also didn't want Peter to go to jail. He even suggested that his partner Peter enter into a sham marriage to kind of avoid this public scandal. It never happened, though. Despite the pressures, their partnership remained. They had a great partnership for 40 years. And then in 1957, they actually moved in together, and they stayed that way. It was the Red House. It is still there. And that's where they lived. It's where they composed. It's where rehearsed. It's where this house had a lot of musicians and artists come through. It was just a great creative huddle spot, but it was also their home. At one point, they meet Imogen Holst, the daughter of Gustav Holst, and they become friends. And Imogen starts working with him. She becomes his assistant, and then she's studying, and she becomes a conductor and scholar on her own merit. But she also starts working with them together to create a thing called the Eldenburg Festival. The Eldenburg Festival was a musical festival that would showcase like new classical music alongside traditional repertoire. It is still going today. This festival is now one of the most important music festivals, especially for classical music in Europe. And it attracts musicians and composers and audiences from all around the world. In the early 70s, his health begins to decline. Now, he always has kind of a fragile health. And then in 1973, he ends up having to have heart surgery. It was successful, but he never bounced completely back. So his composing was greatly reduced. And then a few years later, in the end of 1976, he passed away. His partner, Peter, still stayed alive for quite a while, and Peter and Imogen continue to promote the works of Benjamin Britten. He left behind a vast catalog of works. He created some of the most important vocal works for the 20th century, helped England get back to be one of the powerhouses in opera in the 20th century as well, and started this great festival where people, even today, new composers can be highlighted and showcase their works. He has left a lot. And I haven't really talked a lot about his works, but he left a lot. He did not just do operas, he did a lot of choral work and other works as well. So go and listen to Something or Many Somethings by Benjamin Britten.